Very curious about what you've seen and the facts on the ground. But since you mentioned the sadism, what are folks not understanding about the culture of these Border Patrol officers and these ICE officers? That's where it begins, is the culture and how Trump is enabling it.
Border Patrol was designed to be a carry guns enforcement organization that dealt principally with males and for many years principally with Mexico. They saw themselves and they still see themselves as guardians of the gate. And their function over the years has been vastly expanded. They still carry weapons, still see weapons in the detention center. They're police force. So what happens, I think, culturally, people who go into the government service of Border Patrol, this is what they're signing up for, law enforcement. So then you put them at Border Patrol posts with lots of children, and what you have is a jail for children with jailers. And they're unable to, culturally, I think, to distinguish between their mission, what they think it is, if you look on their website, CBP website, what they say it is. And then you've got this tremendous discourse, this rhetoric that the administration is spewing. And the rhetoric is designed to be divisive. It's designed to keep our society fractured and to increase the divisions, because anytime you have divisions, it's easier to consolidate central power. So if you make somebody who's identifiable the other, which is what the administration is very busy doing, they're the other, they're the rapists, they're the caravans of brown people who are coming to invade us. If you do that and you're successful, you obfuscate what's actually happening to people. You've got the images of the caravans, these vast groups of people moving like an army through Latin America. But then that's not good enough because the image stops when they go into Border Patrol. So what do? You start releasing people with ankle GPSs in huge numbers. You drop them off at bus stations in McAllen and San Antonio, at places in Texas and in Arizona that are close to the places where these people are apprehended and where they would be detained. So you dump a whole lot of people, no resources. So you make this mass of people. So visually, you've created the rhetoric and made it into reality, but it's artificial. There are 758 people at Dilley recently, ICE, the Family Detention Center, that holds, I think, 21 or 2,300. ICE has a huge facility staffed up by the for-profit contractor GEO that is ready, waiting, available, and has in the past detained mothers and children, detained families.
And that's the profit-seeking incentive that a lot of the public doesn't understand, because, it's a classic moral hazard. There's a reason you can't get fire insurance on your neighbor's house, because you burn the house down. We can read what we see from the outside. What have you seen personally, and what did you expect to see?
In 2017, Judge Dolly G., who's got the Flores case, issued a massive order condemning CBP for violations of Flores. What we saw in 2019 are exactly the same conditions: no soap, no water, insufficient nutrition, lights on all the time, freezing cold, no access to family, all of the things that we found. Plus, we found rampant disease. And this is really important because if you take a kid and they have a fever and they have the flu and you make them sleep on concrete under a light with 24-hour lights, what have you done? Every child we saw had the same flu or had the same flu or was in some stage of recovery. Mom, babies, and they're sleeping on concrete floor and they have no blanket. The aluminum blankets are like cheap aluminum foil. They're not a heavy-duty Mylar emergency blanket. The kids, the nutrition, they aren't getting enough calories. There's no fruit. They drink a colored water that they think is juice. It's colored water. One of the things that we saw that was new is a public health crisis in the Border Patrol centers, children not being examined properly, not being given medication, and not being in a circumstance that a person needs to be in to heal. So you've got kids with the flu packed in cages with other children who aren't sick. What's going to happen?
Under the law, What are our obligations? What is the United States government's obligations to provide care for these children and adults when they're in custody? And how's that being violated?
Well, let's just talk about children because children are covered by the Flores Agreement and they have to have safe and sanitary conditions, which includes access to soap and water, toilets, adequate room in the detention areas, adequate ventilation and proper climate control, adequate nutrition, snacks because children need snacks. Under the rubric of nutrition, babies are not given baby food. Baby bottles not being washed so they become contaminated. You need to give children adequate food, proper food, a balanced diet, and food appropriate to their age. The Flores Agreement requires that all conditions take into account the special vulnerabilities of children. They're supposed to have medical care, particularly in an emergency, which a flu certainly constitutes an emergency. They are supposed to be properly supervised. You don't leave children alone in cages taking care of other babies to whom they're unrelated. That is not a proper supervision. So what's required are the things that you would expect your child to have if they were detained in another country. They're very basic. Children are supposed to pass very quickly through Border Patrol facilities and be taken to licensed shelters. Now, what's happening with these influx shelters, like Homestead, for example? They're warehousing kids. They don't have the capacity because they're a for-profit contractor and they're not putting resources in release. They are not properly releasing kids. They're warehousing kids at $750 a day. Properly managing the release function costs pennies on the dollar, and they're not licensed. Licensed facilities where children are supposed to be kept means that there are state standards about nutrition, about the amount of space a child has to have, about where they sleep, what the beds look like, all kinds of things. And licensing authorities have an unrestricted right to inspect anytime they want. So there is a non-federal authority that has the right to go in. By putting children in these large influx centers, 2,300 kids, 2,100 kids in all these different places, they are unlicensed, which is how they pack kids in, how they get around the kinds of requirements that are considered by the state safe and necessary for dependent children. So you've got for-profit actors accountable to shareholders and to their executives having to justify how they're managing the money. What happens when you detain kids and your motivation is profit? When you release a kid, you lose that bed dollar.
Now, what about the adults under the law? What is the obligation? Because we're seeing, of course, people dying, reports of sexual assault, violence. We can go down the list of this barbarism.
Adults are also supposed to be held in safe conditions. These are not supposed to be jails. These are detention centers. Criminals of every kind, whether they're found in this population or they're found in the United States population, are put in jail. Depending what it is, people need to have bond hearings. They need to show that they're not going to abscond, that they're not a danger. Most people are not going to abscond and they're not a danger. If you look at the real statistics of who shows up at their deportation hearings, you see that the majority of people show up for their deportation hearings. And if you drill down on why don't they, you find they lack transportation and the courts are really far away. They can't get off work without losing their jobs, or they don't get notice of their court hearing. You can be deported in absentia.
So was it last week or the week before we had the hearing where you had a Trump administration attorney basically arguing that people don't need access to beds, soap, toothbrushes? In terms of as an attorney, are you allowed to turn down a case and say this is against my conscience, to say I will not stand for this? I'm just curious about the ethics involved.
You have to be able to zealously represent your client. If you can zealously represent your client, then whether you believe their position or not is irrelevant, unless it's a criminal case. When we're in law school, we're taught to argue both sides of a issue. We operate as individuals when it comes to our moral conscience. Under Flores, because it's litigation, I'm not allowed to talk about what we see. But when I had a baby who was going to die in CBP custody and I couldn't get the baby and mom out, I went to the media because I have a duty to do everything to prevent harm for them. It's greater than my duty to that litigation.
Literally, what did you see with this poor child and her mother?
I identified who we wanted to see, but I do it blind off a census. And I decided that I wanted to see young children who had teen mothers, who are both considered unaccompanied, because in this particular horrible situation, this was going to be extra egregious. So there comes in a wheelchair this young girl, obviously in serious pain. And they went over to where she was going to be interviewed. And she had this bundle, this filthy sweatshirt, gray but almost black. She had something wrapped in it, and she pulled back the top of it, and there was this black hair in this teeny tiny itsy bitsy head, and then the face of a premature baby. Mom is in excruciating pain, clearly. That's what I saw. They should never have been there. They've been there 7 days. I mean, what's up with that? She can't walk. She hasn't had a shower. They don't give anything to clean people. Children can't have showers unless they take them with the parents. I took a Kleenex and I cleaned black dirt off the neck of this premature baby. I mean, what can you say about that? So I worked within the system initially to try to get her released, not with Border Patrol, but up above with the lawyers who are responsible for this. I took it myself to the highest level. And when I couldn't get her released and I believed that the baby was at risk of dying, then I went to the media. The government is responsible for that. Normal people would behave. That child and her baby would have been out of there within hours after I identified them and showed them to the government. She was identified to the government at 10 o'clock on Tuesday. She did not arrive at the place at the OR shelter until 5 o'clock on Thursday. I went to the media very, very early in the morning hours of Thursday. Now, you tell me, it's my view that if that hadn't happened, she would have still been in there 24 hours later. I mean, how can this be that they can't find a place to put one mother crippled up in pain who's 17 years old and one premature baby somewhere safe? Eventually, they put them in the no-RR shelter. They both needed medical care, continued to see them, and I continue to have somebody seeing them. I continue to represent them. It's a horror. And what happened to her backstory is very grim. Why she comes here is very, very grim. Why did she have to endure this?
As has been explained to me looking at these charts, one of the reasons they're moving these human beings to military bases is that will limit oversight. Is that true?
Yes. Now, Flores attorneys always have access to these places under the Flores Agreement, which the government has proposed regulations to eliminate, and it specifically eliminates the right of anybody to go in there. Influx centers are not licensed, so state authorities can't go in there. They have blocked from Casa Padre, from Homestead. They have blocked congressional representatives. They have blocked human rights groups. When I had this girl and I couldn't get her out, I called 911. I called the police in McAllen and said, there's somebody dying in there. They took me very seriously. They took a report and said, we can't go in there. It's federal property. I called Child Protective Services in McAllen, Texas. They again took a report, but said, we can't go in there. Same thing is true when you put children on these bases. Local police won't go on there. Local firefighters won't go on there, except some of these places actually rely on local police to go in there. Homestead is one where they claim you can't go on because they're federal property, but they told me, which is in a declaration that was filed with Flores enforcement motion that was filed May the 30th, which is why I can talk about it. It's in my declaration. They told me that they would rely on local police and local firefighters, and that they had local police come on for various police type functions. But if you're on federal property, you're supposed to have only federal marshals, only federal firefighters, and no oversight. ORR is very poorly staffed. I don't know. I do not believe myself that they operate very independently of the for-profit contractors that they depend on to house a child. The experiences I have had personally have shown me that they don't. There is too close of a relationship between ORR supervision in the field and the contractors running these centers. They're setting up more large influx centers. If you released children, which cost a penny on the dollar compared to detaining them in these places, if you release them as you can, I could set up a program for release. I can tell you what you need to do. You put a couple of good managers in there, you clean up this problem in record-breaking time. Then you don't need influx shelters. You don't need children in Border Patrol, although no child should ever go into Border Patrol, ever. children should go right to ORR. They should never go into Border Patrol. That isn't one of the items that's on the congressional agenda is shame on them.
So we have reports, again, folks not having soap and water, people drinking out of toilets, people not having places to sleep, children and adults saying that the Border Patrol agents wake them up in the middle of the night to torture them, to not let them sleep, hundreds of people to a room. Under international law and American law, does this constitute cruel and unusual punishment, some sort of torture?
Absolutely it does. It is sadistic and cruel behavior that rises, in my view, to the level of torture. I think we are in violation not only of our own law, but of international law governing refugees and asylees. Absolutely. We should be being condemned vigorously by other countries who are our allies and countries where we have held countries to other standards that we are violating. We've shut off, over the course of my adult life, we've shut off aid to so many countries because they're violating the humanitarian rules of international law. We are doing the same thing. I want to tell you one story that goes to what you're talking about. I met a little girl, it's not in the recent trips, it's in another trip. And she said to me, she was 10 and she had been separated from her mother. And she was in CBP. And she was this beautiful little child. She was from Honduras, just beautiful little 10-year-old child. And she didn't have very much affect going on her face anymore. She was very traumatized. And she said to me, when I was in that place and I was in that cage, I couldn't go to sleep because it was so cold and they had the lights on all the time. And sometimes I would just get so sleepy and I would lay down on the concrete and I'd go to sleep. And as soon as I'd go to sleep, one of the police would come and kick me. And I would sit up and say, yes, what do you want? And they would walk away. And they kept doing that every time I fell asleep. And she said to me, why would they do that? What am I supposed to say to this child? That they are sadistic and they're torturing you? I just said, baby, I don't know. I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm so sorry. That's not going to happen to you anymore. Because she's out of Border Patrol. She's not going to get kicked like that somewhere else. That's what happened in Border Patrol. But this is the kind of cruel behavior. Why did they do that? Why did they have her sleeping on the floor in the first place in freezing cold in a cage? We have to start there. Keeping the lights on all the time and having noise all the time, which you have, and guards waking you up and shaking things against the cage, that's what we do when we torture people that we have as prisoners of war. And when we're doing black torture of people in the other countries for the Taliban, which we are forbidden to do here, those are techniques that are standard, keeping people in light, not allowing them to sleep. Those are essential elements of torture.
So in terms of the folks you met and what you've observed directly, are they behaving the bare minimum of the law? Do they seem professional? Are they acting in a way so they wouldn't get in trouble, but one wonders what they do when they're not observed? Because that's one of the things that Ocasio-Cortez was alluding to a few hours ago.
In one sense, they're very professional. In another sense, a Border Patrol officer said to me, I said something about a baby, and he said, well, these teenage girls shouldn't be having babies anyway. They're promiscuous. That shows not only judgmental behavior about something he doesn't know, but a complete lack of understanding of what happens to these children in the lawless societies that are Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. There is a lot of sentiment that was expressed to me that these people should never have come and they should be treated as people who shouldn't be here, and they should be harshly treated because it will deter others, which has been shown not to be true. Every Border Patrol officer is not horrible, certainly. There's a culture that brings people into that fold so that good people could be silenced. I don't think everybody in Border Patrol is bad by any means. I think some people join Border Patrol to be of service to their country. I think that some number of people get co-opted by the culture, certainly. They're a law enforcement agency and they behave like one, and they are dealing with a vulnerable population with no voice. These people don't vote, so they are not a constituency for any congressperson. Failure to have meaningful legislative solutions over all these years to the problems of immigration in part has to do with the lack of pressure, because these people whom they're incarcerating, the other, as the administration would have us believe, don't have a voice in the public discourse. And certainly precious children. I wanted to say to you that these are just children. When I sit 3 feet away from a 6-year-old, This is a child like any 6-year-old who should be playing outside, who should be climbing a jungle gym, who should be laughing with their friends and be tickled by their mom and eating ice cream from the ice cream truck. I mean, the children are kept like a lump. They're the children. And when the president said the other day, oh, well, you should see where they come from. They come from poverty. The implication is that we are treating them well because where they come from, they've got it worse, which is just such bizarre thinking. I mean, we're the United States of America. We take care of children. We should take care of everybody's children. They're just children, and many of them are just babies. They're little children. They're just beautiful little children. Beautiful little children. And I can't emphasize enough to you how my team and the Flores team who go in these places are struck again and again by the beauty of these children. And here is this filthy little child who's in front of me, filthy, scared to death, crying, tears running down, sick with a fever. And I look at that child and all I see is a baby who should be being held, who should be being comforted, who should be being with his mom and dad, who should be in the sunlight, not 20 days locked in a cage under fluorescent lights. I saw a baby who had been there with his teen mom for 20 days. He looked like he was made of wax. He'd had the flu. His mom had the flu 20 days. On Saturday, that was Monday, on Saturday, she was still there. 25 days. That baby, she can't put that baby down on the concrete even if she wanted to because there's no room. There are children layered on the floor and other people sitting. There are no furniture in those rooms. There's a toilet in the corner. One girl told me that the toilet was overflowing. The only place for them to be at night was to sit scrunched up against that toilet. And she had her young niece with her. And she took this piece of aluminum foil that's supposed to be a blanket and wrapped it around her niece's head so the niece wouldn't vomit from the stench. These are children.
So you can't predict the future. If you were going to talk to the American people to prepare them for news that will be forthcoming through investigations for what is more likely than not, what do you want the American people to be prepared for? Because I'm on the record saying the folks have not heard anything yet. What's going to eventually come out? There are going to be trials.
I want to say to you, listen and think. If this was your child, what would you do? And as you see these stories, horror stories coming out, don't turn away. We need to shine a light. You need to be the voice that keeps the dialogue going. Don't let it go just because the news cycle goes and it's too awful to think about. Don't do it. Don't do it. Keep the light on it. Keep talking about it. Talk about it at your book club, in your church group, to your family. Go to your legislators and demand that they call this out, they keep it in the light, and they argue things that people like me and the other people you've been seeing in the news from Flores and people who know about it say, these will be real solutions. Raise your voice. Just raise your voice.
And finally, because it's the million-dollar question, and again, I'm on the record with this, and I'm very curious as to your thoughts, are these concentration camps, what does this make America look like before the world?
I was asked when I was in McAllen there's a French show that's like 60 Minutes, and they're doing an expose on this, and they asked they could film me. They are shocked in France to hear this. They don't believe that this is happening in America. We are already greatly imperiled in our visibility in the world by this administration. This adds fuel to the fire. There are very right governments in Europe, anti-immigrant governments, but people are people, and people feel for other people in these kinds of circumstances. I think we're in bad shape internationally. I think we're in worse shape domestically.
And are these, would you describe them as concentration camps? Because again, that has legal meaning too, once you start to use that language.
To me, these are brutal detention facilities where people are being cruelly, inhumanely, and sadistically treated. I am not an expert on what constitutes a concentration camp. I don't know about that. I only know what I saw. And in the ORR shelters, children are marched in groups of 6 or 12 with the monitors, they call them, or the youth workers, whatever, with no privacy, with eyes on at all times. in very militaristic settings when they go to the next place after CPB, which are the ORR shelters. And I think our conversation needs to turn to what happens when they get out of one hell and they go to another, a much more benign looking place, but run for profit off the dollars of the taxpayers and off the backs of babies. And I think that needs to be our next conversation. There's a lot to say on that hasn't been said. Border Patrol saying it's not our fault. It's the fault of Office of Refugee and Resettlement, who doesn't have enough shelter beds. We understand in this country, we understand the profit motive. We are a capitalist society. We understand how things work. We need to look at this ORR. It needs to be our next thing. We need not to let this drop off our radar and understand that these are just kids. I keep coming back to that, but that's the bottom line. They're just babies. They're just children like our children. This is un-American. This is against fundamental principles of liberty, life, justice, the things that inform our American culture. This is diametrically opposite to how we value ourselves and how we see ourselves as Americans.